happened, we would have had her back. Unfortunately, this type of shit happens every single game to her, and the league and the refs do absolutely nothing about it.
It's been a minute since you got fined on this podcast.
I have, but then like you see the videos of like literally kneeing and cheap shotting C in the throat. Like if she did that to any of our teammates, we'd be pissed.
There are moments in professional sports where the game itself becomes secondary to what happens inside of it. Moments where a single sequence of events exposes fractures so deep that no amount of polished league statements or carefully worded press releases can paper over the damage. June 24th, 2025 became one of those moments for the WNBA, and it wasn't because of a spectacular buzzer beater or a record-breaking performance. It was because one player punched another player in the throat, drove a knee into her midsection, stepped over her body like she was nothing more than an obstacle on the pavement, and walked away without hearing a single whistle. 3 referees stood on that court, 3 sets of eyes trained on the action, 3 professionals whose sole responsibility was to protect the integrity and safety of the game, and all 3 of them watched it happen and did absolutely nothing. But the real story, the one that sent shockwaves rippling through the basketball world and ignited a firestorm that the WNBA front office is still trying to contain, didn't come from the game footage itself. It came 2 days later from a podcast microphone, from the voice of a teammate who had seen enough, swallowed enough, and stayed silent long enough. Sophie Cunningham sat down, looked into the camera, and proceeded to say every single thing the league was praying nobody with actual credibility would ever say out loud. She named names. She pointed fingers. She called out the referees, the opposing player, the league's own leadership, and the culture of targeted physicality that she believes has been allowed to fester around one specific player for years. And she did it all without flinching, without hedging, and without a single word of the carefully rehearsed diplomatic language that professional athletes are trained to deploy when the stakes get this high. What Sophie Cunningham said on that podcast didn't just make headlines. It cracked open a conversation that the WNBA has been desperately trying to keep contained since the moment Caitlin Clark stepped onto a professional basketball court. A conversation about jealousy, about institutional resentment, about selective officiating, and about a league that seems pathologically incapable of protecting its single biggest asset. This is the full story of what happened on June 24th, why Sophie Cunningham responded the way she did, and what all of it means for the future of the Indiana Fever, the WNBA, and the most polarizing player in women's basketball history. To understand the magnitude of what unfolded on June 24th, you need to understand the context surrounding it. The Indiana Fever weren't limping into this game as underdogs hoping for a lucky bounce. They were a team building genuine momentum, anchored by a roster that featured Caitlin Clark operating.
Was reportedly suspended for 1 game, and it has now been announced that she will have to pay a $1,000 fine for that situation that occurred with Caitlin Clark. A lot of folks feel like she should have been suspended for 3 or 4 games, and I have to be honest with you, bruh. I gotta completely agree. What Alyssa Thomas displayed on the basketball court was lack of sportsmanship and lack
at a level that was making even her most vocal critics run out of counter-arguments. Clark had been steadily ascending throughout the 2025 season, putting up numbers that placed her among the most productive players in the entire league, while simultaneously driving television ratings, ticket sales, and social media engagement to heights the WNBA had never seen before and might never see again. The Phoenix Mercury came into the matchup with a different kind of energy. They were a physical team, a team built around imposing their will through contact and aggression, and the game plan they carried into the arena that evening would become painfully obvious before the first quarter was even halfway done. Phoenix didn't come to outshoot Indiana, they came to outmuscle them, and the specific target of that physicality was clear from the opening possession. Clark was the bullseye. The first quarter unfolded with escalating contact that the referees seemed determined to ignore. Bumps on screens went uncalled. Hand checks that would have drawn whistles in any other matchup were waved off. The Mercury defenders crowded Clark's space with a level of aggression that crossed the line from competitive physicality into something more deliberate, more targeted, and more personal. And the officiating crew, led by referee Angelica Suffren, set the tone early by keeping their whistles silent. It was an invitation, and Alyssa Thomas accepted it with enthusiasm. With 6 minutes and 52 seconds remaining in the second quarter, the play that would eventually dominate every sports broadcast, every social media timeline, and every podcast in the basketball universe took place in real time on a live national broadcast. Clark drove toward the basket. 3 Phoenix defenders converged on her, which itself tells you something about how seriously the Mercury took Clark as a threat. 3 players collapsing on one ball handler is a schematic decision. It means the coaching staff identified Clark as the player they absolutely had to stop, and they were willing to leave other Fever players open to do it. In the chaos of that convergence, Alyssa Thomas's arm swung forward and connected directly with Clark's throat. Not her shoulder, not her chest, her throat. The most vulnerable, most dangerous point of contact you can make on another human being's upper body short of their head. Thomas's fist struck Clark in the throat area with enough force that it was visible on the broadcast feed, visible in the arena, and visible to anyone standing within 50 feet of the play. Clark went down, and then Thomas did something that removed any possible argument that the contact was incidental or accidental. She drove her knee into Clark's midsection, a second deliberate act of aggression against a player who was already absorbing the impact of the first one. And then came the part that tells you everything you need to know about what was running through Alyssa Thomas's mind in that moment. She stepped over Clark's body, not around her, not past her while offering a hand to help her up the way competitors who respect each other do even in the most heated games. She stepped directly over Clark the way you step over something on the ground that you don't consider worth acknowledging. It was a statement. A deliberate, unmistakable, intentional statement made with the full knowledge that cameras were rolling and millions of people were watching. 3 referees were on the floor. All 3 had clear sightlines to the play. The broadcast cameras captured the sequence from multiple angles with enough clarity that viewers at home could see exactly what happened without needing a single replay, and not one whistle came out.
This account right here, he stated Caitlin Clark is a b-ball superstar who get constantly treated unfairly on the court. She gets a fist to the throat. For example, as a fan, I don't appreciate ill treatment. So refs start treating Caitlin like you do every other player.
Not one official stepped forward to call a foul, assess a technical, or stop the game to review what had just occurred. The play was allowed to stand as if nothing noteworthy had happened at all. But that wasn't the end of it, because June 24th wasn't a 1-incident game for Clark, it was a 4-incident game. Separate from everything Thomas did in that sequence, a Mercury defender launched herself at Clark during a 3-point attempt with zero regard for Clark's landing space. The defender flew into Clark's body while Clark was still in the air, landing directly on top of her with uncontrolled momentum that sent Clark crashing to the floor. Clark immediately grabbed her back after coming down, a detail that matters enormously because Clark had been managing a back issue coming into the game. A reckless closeout that lands a defender's full body weight on a shooter who's already dealing with a back injury isn't just a missed call. It's a potential career-altering moment that the officiating crew treated as background noise. That play was never reviewed, not during the game, not during a timeout, and not even during the post-game process that eventually led to Thomas's suspension. It simply vanished from the official record as if it never happened. Clark left the game in the third quarter. She had already accumulated 19 points and 8 assists in just 20 minutes of floor time. She was cooking. The Fever were in a competitive game, trading blows with Phoenix in a matchup that could have gone either way. And their best player, their franchise cornerstone, the player responsible for more revenue and attention than any individual in the history of the league, was forced to the bench because her body had absorbed too much unchecked punishment to continue. Phoenix won 111-109, 2 points. A 2-point margin in a game where the Fever's best player was removed from the action in the third quarter because 4 separate incidents of excessive physical contact went uncalled by the officials on the floor. The Mercury didn't just win a basketball game on June 24th. They won a basketball game that was fundamentally altered by officiating failures so egregious that the league itself would later have to acknowledge them through a post-game review. But by then, the damage was done. The game was over, the result was in the books, and Caitlin Clark was in the training room instead of on the court where she belonged. The WNBA conducted its post-game review of the June 24th footage and released its findings on June 25th. The league upgraded the throat contact from Thomas to a flagrant foul 2, the most severe foul classification in the sport, and issued a 1-game suspension to be served on June 27th when the Mercury visited the Toronto Tempo. 1 game against Toronto for a fist to the throat. The league's own language in the announcement described the contact as Thomas recklessly making contact with her fist to the throat area of Indiana Fever's Caitlin Clark. Read that sentence again carefully. The WNBA itself used the words fist and throat in the same sentence. They acknowledged the severity of the contact. They acknowledged where it landed. They acknowledged the recklessness of the act. And then they decided that all of that was worth exactly 1 game and a $1,000 fine. To put that in perspective, a $1,000 fine for a professional athlete earning a WNBA salary is the
Like the 30-year commemorative thing, which that you're on it, that's cool.
Why would you ever put me on it?
But people are up in arms that Caitlin's not on it. And then also watching her get kind of her ass kicked last night, I do see everyone being like, why does the league not protect this person? I don't want to get in beef with Kathy either, but it is like she's jealous of her, or like thinks that like because she's a bigger face than her or like anyone the WNBA's had, that she like
equivalent of asking someone making $50,000 a year to pay for a parking ticket. It's not a punishment. It's an administrative formality. It's the league checking a box so they can point to it later and claim they took action. The fine itself is so negligible that it functions more as an insult to Clark than as a consequence for Thomas. The 1-game suspension wasn't much better. Thomas sat out a road game against a team that had no bearing on the Mercury's playoff positioning and returned to action immediately afterward as if nothing had happened. She didn't miss a rivalry game. She didn't miss a nationally televised showcase. She didn't miss a game against Indiana where she'd have to face Clark and the Fever with the weight of actual consequences hanging over her. She missed one game against Toronto, collected her $1,000 receipt, and moved on. Fans were not interested in moving on. The reaction that erupted across social media in the hours following the league's announcement was not the standard cycle of outrage that flares up after a controversial call and fades by the next news cycle. This was sustained, escalating fury driven by people who pulled up Thomas's complete history of incidents and realized that the June 24th sequence wasn't an aberration. It was the latest entry in a pattern that stretched back years and involved a specific, disturbing list of targets. People called for 5-game suspensions. They called for 10-game suspensions. They called for 20-game suspensions. Some called for a lifetime ban, and when you trace the full scope of what Thomas has done across multiple seasons to multiple marquee players, that demands start sounding less like hyperbole and more like the only response proportional to the behavior. If June 24, 2025 existed in isolation, the conversation around it would still be significant. A fist to the throat is a fist to the throat regardless of context, but June 24th doesn't exist in isolation. It exists at the end of a long, documented trail of incidents involving Alyssa Thomas and a remarkably consistent category of victims, the biggest names in the league. Go back to the 2024 season. Thomas ran through Clark's entire body during a play where she made no attempt whatsoever to play the basketball. It wasn't a hard foul on a driving layup or a reach in that caught too much arm. It was a straight body check, the kind of hit you see in hockey when a defenseman lines up a forward crossing the blue line. No basketball play was attempted. The only objective was to deliver force to Clark's body. The referees called nothing. Thomas noted the result and filed it away. Later in that same stretch of games, Thomas connected with Clark's jaw, a direct shot to the face that went uncalled and unpenalized. Another data point. Another confirmation that the officials were not going to protect Clark from this particular player regardless of what happened on the floor. Then came the 2025 WNBA playoffs, and the target changed. Nafisa Collier, the Minnesota Lynx superstar widely regarded as one of the 3 or 4 best players on the planet, found herself on the receiving end of a Thomas collision that left Collier with an ankle injury severe enough to keep her sidelined for nearly a year. As of this writing, Collier still hasn't returned to full action. One of the most talented, most valuable, most important players in the entire sport had her season and potentially her career trajectory altered by contact from Alyssa Thomas. Thomas kept playing. No significant punishment materialized. Angel Reese was next. Thomas clotheslined Reese during a 2025 game with the kind of contact that would get you permanently banned from any recreational basketball facility in the country. A clothesline isn't a basketball play. It's not a hard foul that went wrong. It's an arm swung horizontally at neck level with the intention of stopping a player's forward progress by force. Reese absorbed it. Thomas stayed on the floor, stayed in the game, and continued operating. And then there was Cameron Brink in the unrivaled league. Brink was playing with a documented broken nose. Every player on every roster knew about the injury because it was visible, publicized, and impossible to miss. Thomas went directly after the exact spot where Brink's nose was already damaged, not incidentally, not as a byproduct of aggressive defense. She targeted the specific point on Brink's face that was already compromised. That's not competing hard. That's identifying a vulnerability and exploiting it with the intention of causing additional harm. Now look at the names on that list and ask yourself what they all have in common. Caitlin Clark, Nafisa Collier, Angel Reese, Cameron Brink. These aren't role players. These aren't bench warmers who get 8 minutes in blowouts. These are the most prominent, most marketable, most visible players in the entire sport. Every single one of them is a face of the league. Every single one of them generates headlines, drives viewership, and sells tickets. And every single one of them has been on the receiving end of excessive targeted physicality from the same player. That's not a coincidence. That's a behavioral pattern. And the league, through its consistent failure to deliver punishments commensurate with the severity of the offenses, has spent years teaching Thomas that the pattern carries no meaningful consequences. 1 game and $1,000 for a fist to the throat isn't a punishment, it's permission. Sophie Cunningham didn't learn about the throat strike during the game. She confirmed on her podcast that neither she nor her Fever teammates saw the play happen in real time, which itself tells you something about the chaos and speed of the moment. But when the footage surfaced after the game, when Cunningham sat down and watched what Thomas had done to her teammate from every available angle, her reaction was immediate, visceral, and completely unfiltered. She didn't send a carefully worded tweet through her publicist. She didn't release a generic statement about trusting the league's process and respecting the officials' judgment. She pulled up her podcast, turned on the microphone, and delivered the most explosive public statement any active WNBA player had made about the league's officiating failures in recent memory. Cunningham named Alyssa Thomas directly. She identified the specific plays. She described the contact in plain language without softening a single syllable. And then she made a promise that carried weight precisely because of who was making it and what she had already demonstrated on the court. "I promise you," Cunningham said, "if we would have seen that happen, we would have had her back." That sentence doesn't need interpretation. It doesn't require analysis or contextualization. It means exactly what it says. If Cunningham had been positioned to see Thomas punch Clark in the throat during the game, her response would have been physical, immediate, and unambiguous. She wasn't threatening future retaliation from behind a microphone. She was explaining what would have already happened if circumstances had been slightly different. But Cunningham didn't stop with the Thomas incident. She widened the scope of her critique to encompass the entire officiating structure, the league's internal politics, and what she described as a bizarre, self-destructive pattern of institutional behavior directed at Clark. "This type of stuff happens every single game to her," Cunningham stated, "and the league and the refs do absolutely nothing about it. Every single game, not occasionally, not in heated rivalry matchups, every game. That's a teammate watching from the bench and the court as the player she shares a locker room with absorbs excessive contact on a nightly basis while the officials tasked with protecting her consistently refuse to do so." Cunningham then turned her attention to the league's front office and delivered what might be the most damaging part of the entire podcast episode. She pointed out that the WNBA had recently released a 30th anniversary commemorative poster and Clark wasn't on it. Cunningham herself was on the poster and she found that absurd. "Why would you ever put me on it?" she said with a self-aware laugh that barely concealed her frustration. "That should be Caitlin, that should be Kelsey Mitchell, that should be Aaliyah Boston." She wasn't being falsely modest. She was making a point about a league that seemed to be deliberately suppressing the visibility of its most marketable player. And then she went further, directly addressing what she believed was driving the suppression. "It is like she's jealous of her," Cunningham said, referencing the attitude she perceived from within the league's own power structure. "Or like thinks that because she's a bigger face than her or like anyone in the WNBA's had that she won't give her the platform. It's so weird. It's soap." That's an active player accusing the league's leadership of harboring professional jealousy toward its own star. That's not something you can walk back with a follow-up statement or a clarifying interview. It's a direct accusation with a specific target, and Cunningham delivered it without a moment's hesitation. The podcast episode spread faster than the game footage itself. Within hours, it had been clipped, shared, reposted, and amplified across every major social media platform. Millions of people who hadn't watched the Phoenix, Indiana game heard Cunningham's words before they ever saw the Thomas play that inspired them. And the reason it spread so fast is simple. Cunningham said what a massive audience had been thinking, feeling, and shouting into their screens for months. She just happened to be the first person with genuine credibility, someone who actually plays in the league and stands next to Clark in the huddle, to say it publicly and attach her name to it. Active Fever players couldn't say any of that without drawing fines, phone calls from the league office, and potential disciplinary consequences. They had to stay measured, they had to trust the process, they had to say the right things in the right tone and hope the league eventually got the message through proper channels. Cunningham didn't have that constraint and she used the freedom completely. If Sophie Cunningham had been a player who suddenly discovered her voice on June 25th because the moment was convenient, the podcast episode would have landed differently. People would have questioned the timing, the motivation, and the sincerity. But Cunningham's defense of Clark isn't new. It predates her time on the Fever roster. It predates the 2025 season entirely. And it was established during a period when publicly supporting Clark was neither the popular nor the politically advantageous position inside the league. Before Cunningham ever wore an Indiana uniform, she was on record talking about what Clark meant to the WNBA. Not in vague, generalized terms about the rookie class being good for business, but specifically about Clark's individual impact on viewership, attendance, and the overall trajectory of the sport. She called herself a huge fan of Clark's game, a statement that carried more weight than it might seem because established veterans saying that publicly opened themselves up to criticism from peers who viewed Clark's arrival and immediate stardom with suspicion and resentment. Cunningham saw the jealousy narrative forming in real time among veteran players and chose to position herself on the opposite side of it. While other established names either stayed silent about Clark or made thinly veiled comments questioning whether she deserved the attention she was receiving, Cunningham went public with her support and kept it consistent. When she joined the Fever and became Clark's actual teammate, the support migrated from interviews and social media posts to the basketball court. And the J.C. Sheldon situation became the clearest, most visceral demonstration of what Cunningham's version of having someone's back actually looks like in practice. Sheldon had developed a reputation for playing dirty, and specifically for targeting opponents with eye pokes and other dangerous contact that skirted the line between aggressive basketball and assault. When Sheldon matched up against Clark with Cunningham on the floor, Cunningham didn't limit her response to verbal encouragement from the bench or pointed looks at the officials. She went directly at Sheldon on the court. She took the game to Sheldon personally, aggressively, and with a physicality that sent a message visible to everyone in the arena and everyone watching on television. On one play, Cunningham committed a hard foul on Sheldon as she went up for a layup, wrapping her arms around Sheldon and taking her to the ground. The play was intentional. Cunningham didn't deny it, didn't pretend it was a standard basketball play, and didn't offer a sanitized explanation afterward. She bear hugged another player and brought her down because that player had been targeting her teammate, and Cunningham decided the targeting was going to come with a cost. Players around the league noticed, the basketball world noticed, and the message was received exactly as Cunningham intended it. If you come after Caitlin Clark, you're going to have to come through Sophie Cunningham to do it. And Cunningham isn't the kind of player who makes that threat from a safe distance. She makes it on the hardwood in real time against the player who earned it. That's the track record that makes Cunningham's June 25th podcast episode something more than emotional venting from a frustrated teammate. She'd been proving for over a year that her support for Clark was consistent, public, and backed by action. So when she sat behind that microphone and said, "I promise you, if we would have seen that happen, we would have had her back," everyone listening knew it wasn't rhetoric. It was a statement of established fact. The one-game suspension handed to Alyssa Thomas consumed most of the initial outrage cycle, and understandably so. The disparity between the severity of the offense and the leniency of the punishment was genuinely shocking. But underneath the Thomas conversation, a second crisis was developing that may ultimately prove more consequential for the league's long-term credibility: the complete absence of accountability for the officiating crew that managed the June 24th game. 3 referees stood on that court. Among them was Angelica Suffren, whose name was pulled out specifically by fans and commentators who reviewed the footage and identified her as having a clear sightlane to the throat strike. The broadcast angles showed officials in positions where the contact between Thomas and Clark was plainly visible. Multiple camera feeds captured it without any special enhancement or slow-motion technology. People watching on standard television screens in their living rooms could see a fist connect with a throat in real time. And the referees saw nothing, called nothing, stopped nothing. 4 separate incidents of excessive contact against the same player in the same game, and the officiating crew let every single one of them pass without intervention. That's not one missed call in a fast-moving sequence where angles were blocked and bodies obscured the contact. That's a systematic failure across an entire game, a pattern of non-calls that allowed one team to operate with impunity against one specific player for 40 minutes of basketball. What made the officiating failure even more enraging was the contrast in how the same crew treated Clark on the other end of the whistle. During the same game in which 4 incidents of contact against Clark went uncalled, the officials actually stopped play to review Clark's follow-through on a 3-point attempt, exploring whether Clark herself should be assessed a hostile act for the natural motion of her shooting form. They considered penalizing Clark for shooting a basketball while simultaneously ignoring a fist to her throat. That juxtaposition crystallized something that Clark's supporters had been arguing for months, and that Cunningham articulated bluntly on her podcast. Caitlin Clark is officiated differently than other stars. Not in the way that superstars typically receive favorable treatment, which is its own controversial topic in professional sports, but in the opposite direction. Clark absorbs contact that would generate whistles for other players, gets hit with calls that other players avoid, and watches as the opponents who target her face no in-game consequences for doing so. The league can suspend a player after reviewing tape. It has a mechanism for that, and it used it, however, inadequately with Thomas. But there is no public mechanism for holding referees accountable for failures this egregious. No suspension for Suffren, no public review of the crew's performance. No acknowledgement from the league that its officials failed to protect its most valuable player across 4 separate plays in a single game. The refs walked away clean, returned to their next assignments, and continued officiating WNBA games as if nothing had happened. That structural gap, the ability to punish players but not officials, creates an environment where referees face no consequences for allowing games to be officiated in ways that endanger specific players. And as long as that gap exists, the pattern of selective non-calls against Clark will continue because there's nothing in the system that incentivizes referees to change their behavior. The Indiana Fever aren't a team in transition anymore. They're a team with a championship-caliber core locked in and building momentum toward a genuine title run. Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Lexi Hull, and Sophie Cunningham are all under contract for 2026. The pieces are in place. The trajectory is upward. And sitting directly underneath all of that forward progress is a very specific, very detailed memory of what happened on June 24th and how the league responded to it. Steph White and the Fever's leadership responded to the Thomas suspension with measured professionalism, which is exactly what organizational leaders are expected to do. But measured professionalism in public doesn't mean the incident has been processed and filed away internally. Teams remember. Coaching staffs remember. And locker rooms absolutely remember when their franchise player gets punched in the throat, kneed in the body, and stepped over while the officials watch in silence and the league responds with a parking ticket. The Fever don't need to make public declarations about seeking revenge or adjusting their approach based on what happened. They don't need press conferences or statements. The adjustment happens organically when a team with this much talent and this much collective investment in Clark's well-being takes the floor knowing that the external systems designed to protect their star player have proven unreliable. Cunningham's podcast episode wasn't just a moment of public venting. It was a declaration of principles from a player who has already demonstrated physically on the court that she will impose consequences on players who target Clark even when the officials won't. With Cunningham locked into the Fever roster for next season and beyond, every opponent who considers taking a run at Clark now has to factor in the certainty that the response will be immediate, physical, and delivered by someone who has already shown she's not bluffing. Thomas serves her one game. She pays her $1,000 fine. She returns to the Mercury roster and continues playing professional basketball with a history of incidents that spans multiple years and multiple victims. The league moves on to its next set of games, its next set of controversies, and its next set of post-game reviews that arrive too late to change the outcomes they're supposedly addressing. But the Fever don't move on. Clark doesn't move on. And Cunningham, who stood in front of a microphone and told the entire basketball world exactly what she thinks about Thomas, about the officials, about the league's leadership, and about the culture of targeted violence that she believes has been allowed to metastasize around the best player in women's basketball, she's not moving on either. What happened on June 24, 2025 was more than a dirty play in a basketball game. It was the culmination of years of escalating physical targeting against marquee players by a single individual who learned through experience that the consequences would never match the offenses. It was a systemic officiating failure that left the most watched player in women's basketball history unprotected through 4 separate incidents in a single game. It was a league response so inadequate that it functioned more as validation for the behavior than as a deterrent against it. And it was the moment Sophie Cunningham decided she'd had enough of watching it happen and staying measured about it. Cunningham's podcast didn't create the problems she described. It exposed them. The jealousy among veterans who resent Clark's visibility was already there. The inconsistent officiating that leaves Clark absorbing contact other stars never have to deal with was already there. The league's reluctance to center Clark in its own promotional materials, despite her being the single greatest driver of interest in the sport's history, was already there. And the pattern of Alyssa Thomas targeting the league's biggest names with escalating physical aggression and walking away with negligible consequences was already there, documented across years and multiple victims. What Cunningham did was say all of it out loud with her name on it from a position of credibility that nobody could question. She's not a commentator. She's not a podcaster who covers the league from the outside. She's an active player who shares a locker room with Clark, who has physically defended Clark on the court against players who targeted her, and who was publicly supporting Clark before it was fashionable or safe to do so within the league's culture. The WNBA now sits at an intersection that demands a choice. It can continue operating the way it has, delivering minimal punishments after the fact, protecting officials from accountability, and allowing its institutional ambivalence toward Clark's stardom to shape how the game is played and officiated. Or it can recognize that the path it's currently on leads to a destination where its biggest star either gets seriously injured because the league refused to protect her or leaves for opportunities where her safety and her value are treated as priorities rather than inconveniences. 1 game and $1,000. That's what the league decided a fist to the throat was worth. Sophie Cunningham looked at that number, looked at the history behind it, looked at the officials who enabled it, and concluded that if the system wouldn't protect Caitlin Clark, then the people standing next to her on the court would have to do it themselves. The Fever remember everything about June 24th. They remember the throat strike. They remember the knee. They remember the step over. They remember the reckless closeout that never made it into the review. They remember the officials who watched all of it and kept their whistles in their pockets. They remember the league's response. And they remember that Sophie Cunningham, standing behind a podcast microphone with nothing to shield her from the consequences, said what every single one of them was thinking but couldn't afford to say. The league made its call. Now Indiana gets to make theirs. And with Clark, Boston, Mitchell, Hull, and Cunningham all locked in and building towards something that looks more and more like a championship trajectory, the Fever's answer to June 24th won't come through statements or press conferences. It will come on the court in the games, through the kind of collective resolve that forms when a team watches its best player get punched in the throat and discovers that the only people willing to do anything about it are the ones wearing the same jersey. The real question isn't what the punishment should have been, though the answer to that one is obvious to anyone who's been paying attention. The real question is whether the WNBA understands what it's risking by continuing to treat this situation with the seriousness of a parking violation. Because the fans understand. The players understand. Sophie Cunningham, speaking with a clarity and conviction that the league's own leadership has proven incapable of matching, made sure of that. And the clock is ticking on how long the WNBA can afford to pretend otherwise.